And welcome once again to EWTN's Bookmark. I'm Doug Keck, your host. Our guest author is Jimmy Mitchell. His book, Let Beauty Speak, The Art of Being Human in a Culture of Noise, published by our good friends at Ignatius Press, naturally available through our EWTN religious catalog, EWTNRC.com, for all things Catholic. Welcome to Bookmark, Jimmy.
Thank you so much, Doug.
It's nice to have you here. People might have saw you back when you were on Life on the Rock. You were on that particular program, and you're one of our younger, energetic authors for this particular program, so I hope I can keep up with you. And I thought it was interesting, too, because this is your first book, that for a younger person, I understand the idea of the culture of noise, but the idea of beauty and focusing on beauty, that seems unusual for a person your age.
It's an interesting point because I spent so much of my life in Nashville, surrounded by artists and singer-songwriters who seem to have a little bit of an instinct with beauty. And many of them, if they weren't Catholic, they were very sincerely Christian, and they weren't necessarily doing music for the church. They were doing music for the culture, and kind of had this way of imbuing their artistry with faith. And they found, and I've certainly seen over and over again, the power of beauty to evangelize people in a way that seems very subtle up front, but very, very powerful on the back end. And so because I was around so many people like that for so long, it became an instinct of my own.
Now, in the beginning of the book, you've got a couple of quotes, and one is a dedication for Pope Benedict XVI, whose life and writings have forever shaped my own. Why Pope Benedict?
It's such an amazing, I think, act of divine providence, because this book came out only a few months before, or I should say after he passed away. I was at his funeral just over a year ago in Rome.
Okay, right.
Was one of the crazy 50,000 people who showed up from all over the world with 3 days' notice to pay my respects. I felt so indebted to him. It's in large part because of several addresses that he gave, particularly to Communion Liberation, a movement based in Italy. And you could see in those addresses, even before he was the Pope, Cardinal Ratzinger had such a love for beauty, such a love for the arts. And there's this beautiful line where he says, "To me, art and the saints are the greatest apologetic of our faith." I find that so compelling because he was so brilliant. He could have said the 5 proofs for the existence of God from St. Thomas Aquinas. He could have talked about the church's preferential option for the poor, all of which matter. But for him, beauty always came first.
Right, right. You also use this quote from Esther, "Who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this?" And that seemed to be a central theme of your book, this idea that all of us are called, and this is the time you're called for.
That's exactly right, which I find incredibly ennobling and empowering and exciting when you realize I wasn't placed in 13th century Italy or France. I didn't have an opportunity to be educated by St. John Bosco in 19th century Turin, where I just was a few weeks ago, because Don Bosco is one of my true heroes. I've been always captivated by the saints and the role that they played at key moments in church history, really in world history for that matter. What is our part to play in this time? And yeah, there's a lot that we could say about our culture. At the very least, I think we have to admit that it's full of noise, it's dictated by relativism, as Benedict once said, and it's definitely a time where Christianity has been shelved. We are in a post-Christian culture. And so I'm very convinced, and have seen the fruits of this personally, that when you lead with beauty in this great moment that we call the new evangelization, you can actually get to people's hearts, open them up to the truth, and then actually help really inspire conversion.
Ryan Hanning, PhD, wrote the foreword. He mentions that nostalgia makes a poor excuse for tradition. He's relating that to what somebody else said. But he says, "But we cannot go back, nor should we, for if we did, we would likely bring the illnesses of our age with us." He goes on to say, "It is either for us to run from the future or from our past. We may be broken people in a broken world, but we are pilgrims, not fugitives. We are not meant to run away, rather to journey forward." So that's your view, too. We're pilgrims.
Absolutely. I think there's a hopefulness in that perspective that drives all kinds of creativity and generosity on behalf of the Lord's glory and ultimately the salvation of souls. If we get a little too whimsical or nostalgic about our past, we can very quickly turn into cynics or naysayers or just whiners, and there's a lot of those, even in the church. I think we know those people. But also, if we don't live in reality, and we get a little bit too caught up in dreams or fantasies. That's not helpful either. And being enough of an artist myself, I'm aware of that tendency in me. So there's something about living with our feet firmly planted on the ground in our moment, in our cultural and historical moment, while also shooting for the stars, which is what every great saint always did.
I thought this was interesting. You said our post-Christian culture, as you alluded to, will not be evangelized by a program or a campaign by individual witness of lives lived well. But why does it seem so often the church spends a lot of time putting together programs and campaigns?
Well, I would say for a time we really needed it. I mean, you can look even just at the last 20 years, the catechetical renewal in the life of the church, at least in the United States. It's been astounding to think of what's available right now with a few clicks of the button online. There was nothing like that when I was growing up. And so I'm really grateful for, we'll say, the new media and the way that many people are engaging with content, with programs, with online catechetical institutes. These are all really good things, but the work of evangelization has to still be at its heart soul to soul. If it's going to be in imitation of Christ, there's going to be moments, of course, where he preached to the thousands, and maybe we'll do the same. But it was always so personal and so individual. Even the way that the church grew in the first 3 centuries, 40% a decade. Yeah, there were those moments like Pentecost where thousands were baptized at once. And we can look at the great saints like Francis Xavier and say, wow, okay, 400 souls, he baptized a month on average. That's pretty impressive and pretty unbelievable. But most of us are called to something much more interpersonal, beginning with our family, reaching out to the very people that we work with, that we live with, that we're in the same neighborhood as. And I think sometimes we kind of almost have an excuse to not evangelize the very people closest to us because we're so caught up in a program or caught up on a certain website, which, okay, write those comments to the blog. That's fine. Are you really helping Jesus save souls? I doubt it.
Right.
I doubt it. Maybe moving the needle, but probably not making real transformation.
And as Ryan mentions, the idea, it really starts with you.
That's right.
You got to get the log out of your own eye while you're spending so much time on everybody else, which is not bad, but make sure you're living it out. I thought this was, you say it's tempting to exaggerate the novelty of our age, but yet I'm listening to what you just said. And one of the novelties of our age is the lack of interpersonal communication. So true. But you're saying that's the most important thing in a world of people with AI, characters, and pictures that have no representation at all, people hiding behind their phones, even sitting at the same table and texting each other across the table.
It's very sad, and I think there's an illusion of connection in today's world, and technology certainly assists in a lot of ways in keeping us connected. But what people long for is communion, more than connection. We long for communion. And obviously for us as Catholics, that happens in such an ultimate and transformative way every time we go to receive Holy Communion itself, when we go in communion with our Lord. But even in that longing, properly fulfilled in the Eucharist, we see such a desire for that level of depth, that level of relationship across every aspect of our lives. So the deeper that our Lord pulls us in, the more we realize what we're actually made for, and the kind of platform-based connections and communications that many of us have settled for really don't satisfy anymore.
Now you have what does it mean to be human? How do I live my faith amid hostility and division? What's my unique and unrepeatable role to play at this moment in history? So what's yours?
Is that a personal question?
Yes, it is.
I do feel
You said we had to do one-on-one, so.
I love that, and I do very much feel called to help people bring beauty to the forefront of their lives, and to very much be awakened to the love of God that is poured forth in so many ways, certainly through prayer and all the principles that we talk about in this book, but even just in some of the, we'll say, kind of entry points of the church. There's an amazing story of a student that I work with who walked into a beautiful basilica, immediately began tearing up. And this is just a classic high school athlete. But I'd never seen, we'll say, statues in this case that had been commissioned in Florence, something that was really beyond his day-to-day experience. And it was the very, sort of tears that led to this sense of littleness and gratitude. When we feel little before the greatness of God, it actually brings forth a feeling of deep gratitude and joy. And he came in one day to tell me about this experience, and he said, Mr. Mitchell, you know, I don't know what to do with it, but I feel this burning desire for prayer that I've never felt in my entire life. And then that's a campus minister's dream to then, you know, follow up with that conversation.
Is that what you were doing?
Yeah, at the time. And so I think that's a really good example of so much of my personal calling, which is to help people see that every encounter with beauty is ultimately an encounter with Christ. And that he's calling you to bring his beauty into the world and to join him in his great mission of redemption.
Well, you even talk about the idea of your own experience, I guess, was it flying to New Zealand?
That's right.
With the multiple sunsets?
That's exactly right.
But I always think about people who used to say, well, I don't have to go to church. I could just see God in the sunset.
Fair enough, I suppose, but I'm not playing that risk.
Okay.
I'm not gonna gamble on that instinct, because I think all of us can recognize that. Yeah, Chesterton put it this way: you know, the saddest moment in the life of an atheist is when he's filled with a profound sense of gratitude with no one to thank. If we're not giving God his due for at least 1 hour a week, that's all he actually requires. 1 hour out of 168, worshiping Almighty God, you know, the holy sacrifice of the Mass. That's the very thing that even tunes us in to recognize his beauty in the sunset, lest that become an idol, actually. And I think that's the danger for many of us, as we've turned beauty itself into something of an idol at times, rather than connecting the dot with the author of all that is beautiful, which is God.
Right,
Always.
I can see your connection to Benedict because of relativism, which you talk about, the importance of the impact of that. Endless distractions. You say over the last few years, the implosion of Christian faith and culture has accelerated at a rapid pace with the relegation of religion outside of the public square. You go on to say, meanwhile, our hearts are filled with quiet desperation. The noise has numbed our infinite desire for God. So what's the first step?
Yeah, I think the first step is a little bit of a detox for many of us. I mean, there's a lot of men across the world right now doing a program called Exodus 90. First time I did that was 10 years ago, 7, 8 years ago, and it transformed my life, because suddenly my phone was off unless I was using it for work or for school. For the first time, I was taking cold showers every day. And actually kind of enjoying it by the time I got out. And, you know, there was this discipline and this asceticism that awakened something in me, which is, again, this infinite desire for more. I think a lot of us numb that existential ache with passing pleasures. And they're not always, you know, sins. That's the problem. A lot of times we just forget that things quickly become idols when they seize our imagination and attention and affection more than the love of God. And so I think for a lot of us, we got to figure out what is it that is keeping our deeper desires, you know, beneath the surface. And we've got to get rid of those things for even just a time to reawaken those desires. And then really the most important thing is prayer. Without a deep interior life, a relationship with God that is intimate and consistent, we'll easily settle for the ways of the world, and we'll find ourselves, you know, depressed at some point, miserable perhaps, but always longing for more.
Do you find, or you're thinking, all this noise, and even when it's good noise, so to speak, it saps our energy, it gives us fatigue. And there's a great quote, I think it was Vince Lombardi who said, fatigue makes cowards of us all.
That's right.
And it's harder to fight the fight when one is tired, and it's in that quiet that we can recapitulate ourselves.
Yes, and there's really a whole chapter on this, and it's the chapter on leisure, which rebuilds and restores and recreates the soul in a way that, we'll say, loafing, mindless amusement doesn't, right? So we have this idea of leisure just being how we spend our free time, and that's maybe a way to categorize it. But if we're going to really engage with intentional leisure, then it's going to actually bring about an interior, again, restoration. There's a stillness and a silence that's required, almost as a precursor to the encounter with truth and beauty and goodness and things that are real, things that actually bring fulfillment. So leisure helps precondition the soul to better encounter the true, the good, and the beautiful. Leisure, by slowing us down and allowing for an interior rest, even briefly every day. And I would say prayer is where this happens most perfectly. And the Mass is the highest form of leisure. It has a way of pulling us out of the weeds of life. So we're flying 10,000 feet, you know, with God, with the angels, with the saints, and again, not settling for for less.
Right. You say great evangelists never took their eyes off beauty. Their relationship with Jesus Christ wasn't a transaction, but a romance. While there are many enemies of truth and goodness in today's culture of noise, rare are the enemies of beauty. So you think beauty connects even with people who might be resistant to the message?
It seems to be the case. You know, whether you're standing on top of a mountain, looking at a beautiful range, or you know, at a beach somewhere near where I live in Florida, looking at the sunset, or you're holding a newborn child in your arms. These are universal human experiences that leave most of us speechless. And I think there's a starting place there. You know, even in his first apostolic exhortation, Evangelii Gaudium, Pope Francis talks about every encounter with beauty being an encounter with Christ. So people, without even knowing it, are probably having these encounters. They just need language around it. They just need to be kind of invited into this deeper lens of reality, which is connecting the dots between beauty and the Creator. It's at least a wonderful starting place for everybody that I've known and loved, and even tried to evangelize with a Bible in one hand and a catechism in the other, and often found myself fairly unsuccessful. But if I can, you know, bring them in the back door, which is sometimes what beauty is, then I can bring, you know, real conversations about truth to the forefront that then inspire that transformation and that goodness that is the life of a saint. And it's a process.
Right, because you connect beauty and truth and goodness.
They have to be. If they're separated, they're not transcendentals.
Right. You say it's only when the church gets comfortable that she turns in on herself, fades in her beauty, and begins contracting in size. Is that what's been going on since the 1950s here, basically? It
seems that's the case. I mean, even back to your quote, you know, from Coach Lombardi, by the way, he was a daily communicant, wasn't he?
Right,
Pretty impressive Catholic man. You know, comfort is never
Fordham.
good.
Yeah.
No, he did not.
Yeah, he did.
I forgot that detail.
Yeah, he was one of the 7 blocks of granite.
No kidding.
That was his nickname. Yeah,
That's so cool. I was a big Vince Lombardi fan as a kid. I played football as a kid and couldn't put his books down.
Right.
But clearly, you know, comfort is a killer. You know, I don't know there's ever been a season in my life apart from true festivity, leisure, you know, time with family and friends around the holidays. You know, those are moments where, okay, yeah, we can allow ourselves to rest a little bit and to be comfortable. But in every other day or season or even area of my life that I get too comfortable, something starts to die inside. And I think that's been very much true for the church up until, you know, a certain point in this country. You know, I think about Bishop Fulton Sheen being one of 4 people on primetime television back in the 50s.
Sure.
That was a pretty great time for the church in America. You know, it wasn't uncommon to see a priest as a lead role in major Hollywood films, many of which went on to win Academy Awards. That's unthinkable in our time.
Right.
So I think we take those.
It's the opposite now.
It's the exact opposite.
If there's a cleric or clergy, you usually figure there's either something wrong with them or they're the murderer.
That's right. No, we're almost in the
but certainly a
upside
hypocrite.
down.
We know that. They're obviously a hypocrite. What's the Love Good Academy?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that. That's a formation platform that we built. Several friends and I, 3 years ago, launched it, and we release a new course every 3 months alongside a book, often published by Ignatius Press. And sometimes that book is written by the very person that is leading the course. Sometimes it's just another great theologian or priest or kind of thought leader out there in the church. And the idea is, again, through each of these courses to help people live this art of being human, to bring, again, beauty to a place in their lives that, you know, leads to transformation and then this kind of very natural passing on of the faith to others. Because I think that's part of why we, you know, like calling it an art and not a science, is if we get a little too in our head or a little too programmed with how we go about bringing the love of God to others, first of all, awkward, second of all, ineffective, and third of all, probably not all that joyful. But if we can find ways to integrate the faith into our personality, into our vocations, and every fiber of our being ultimately, then suddenly we're just overflowing with God's love and with God's beauty and with God's grace that this world so desperately needs.
Now, you define this more as a how-to guide rather than an academic book. And the layout of the book, each chapter is dedicated to a principle, which we have in here. And you conclude each chapter with practical resolutions, book recommendations that'll take you deeper. If you can, you said, read through each principle as a small group of friends or as a family. Take notes and keep journaling along the way. And there's, 10 principles, I guess, in the book. The first one, I think you start off with wonder, but you could do this by yourself, right? At the
Absolutely.
same time, right?
Absolutely. I'll tell you the reason that doing it with your family or with some friends is so powerful is because suddenly you can process some of these things out loud. You can have a little bit more accountability, especially when you get to the end of each chapter, and there's some very concrete resolutions that you can make, some practical ways to apply this principle to your life. Suddenly, you can commit to something that a friend can, very much check in on and see how it's going.
You use the term an intentional community. What is that?
Oh, I mean, think back to, Saint Benedict. Of course, I don't think he necessarily intended it. He just went off to a cave for a few years and started praying and fasting, and next thing you know, there is this intentional community forming around him, which is the very origin of monastic life in the West. So, okay, we're not all called to be monks, obviously, but we're all called to intentional community. We can't become saints alone. We cannot actually even live our faith in these times alone, maybe any time. And so whether it's our family, our close friends, our parish community, there's got to be an intentionality, not sort of a just idle drifting in our attempts to live
You hear
the
that
faith.
intentional Catholicism as
that's
also
right.
used at that time.
That's right.
Humility born of wonder. How does humility come out of wonder?
Yeah, well, it's back to that story about the young man in the church who's suddenly looking at statues that he's never even thought possible. Maybe he's only seen pictures of. Or any one of us in these moments where we're left in awe and wonder. Again, we feel kind of small. There's this story about Neil Armstrong being on the moon, looking back at the Earth, and he's asked, how'd you feel up there? You must have felt pretty big looking down at a Earth you could cover up with your thumb. And he said, no, you're totally missing it. I felt small. And it was something about being in the vastness of God's creation that led to a humility, which again, gives way to gratitude. And I'm convinced that joy is the overflow of a grateful heart. So if we can get humility, really wonder that leads to humility and ultimately gratitude, we will have the joy that every one of us longs for.
And you say we need virtue to temper our wonder.
That's back to the statement I made earlier about, some of us are a little bit of a dreamer. And I can't help but sometimes get lost in my thoughts, and even not just worries about the future, even hopes for the future can be a little paralyzing at times. So I found that, okay, this is where this second principle is so important, having a deep interior freedom, what we might call joyful self-mastery or virtue, is really important, not only in tempering the wonder, but I would say putting it in its proper place.
Yeah, and chapter 2 is actually on freedom. But you're getting practical in the section still on wonder. Go on to an extended technology fast. That was kind of like what you were talking about with that Exodus thing. I thought you have further reading here, some great books. I want to say a fabulous book, The Evidential Power of Beauty, by Father Thomas Dubay, who I had the great privilege to know and interview several times, including on that particular book.
Oh, that's amazing.
Yeah, and he did. He was here from many series over the years. Great man. He used to call himself, "I'm a vagabond for God."
I love that.
He was so good. In the chapter on freedom, you say we often reduce freedom to mere license. Freedom that has been reduced to license quickly devolves into licentiousness. Enslaved by their base desire, the citizens of such a society, like the United States, can turn in on themselves, seeking comfort to then become incapable of heroic sacrifice. Sounds quite familiar.
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, that's one of our great ideals in this country is freedom, but we often reduced it to this idea of being able to do whatever we want, whenever we want, with whoever we want. And that's not freedom, that's not liberty. That's actually not even just license. At a certain point, that quickly devolves into licentiousness. And I think that's something of one of the key marks of our age is people don't have a sense of even just control or moderation of their passions. And actually the joy that comes out of that when you realize I'm the master here, I'm not the slave,
Right. Well, they have no reason to moderate. There's no downside, at least that they see up front. You say, without virtue, we'll never find freedom from the effects of original sin or to be truly happy. Well, that's part of the problem. Most people either don't believe in original sin. Or think it had, and so we're all born naturally good. It's just those nasty structures in society that make us do bad things.
Yeah, which is exhausting. I mean, I'm thinking about, again, G.K. Chesterton, who had this wonderful one-liner about what's wrong with the world. That was his, I think, topic given by the London Times, and he was asked to respond to that on their front page column. What is wrong with the world? And he said, I am. It was like a two-word response. A whole newspaper column dedicated to 2 words, I am. And again, there's a humility there that says, ooh, actually, I might be inherently good, even very good, because God created me in His image, but I'm severely wounded over here.
That
Sin has really messed me up.
There, right.
That's right. And there's so much joy, and this is what people, again, don't recognize. There's so much joy in holding two things up at once. We used to call this compunction. That's a word that has fallen out of use in our more modern church. But compunction refers to this profound awareness of God's mercy and love, held in perfect juxtaposition with our total unworthiness, our total sinfulness, our nothingness without God. And then suddenly you realize, oh, I don't deserve this, but He's given it to me anyways. That becomes a wellspring of joy.
Right. I think compunction has been replaced by compulsion, where people do whatever the heck they want to do. One last question. I thought this was interesting because you got all the other chapters. People have to get the book. But you went to Vanderbilt, and Facebook was one of the test places.
Yeah.
Right, and you were one of the guinea pigs. But I thought it was, you said, I'll never forget my disappointment when it became available to other university students, eventually to high school students as well. You weren't special anymore? Is that the issue?
Pride.
Really?
Human pride right there.
Right, some sort of Gnostic sense of understanding the future beyond other people. Okay, very good. Jimmy Mitchell,
Doug,
pleasure to meet you.
Thank you.
Keep up the great work. Let Beauty Speak is the title, The Art of Being Human in a Culture of Noise, published by our friends at Ignatius, available through EWTN's religious catalog, EWTNRC.com for all things Catholic. Look for the interview on our on-demand page and on our YouTube channel as well. I'm Doug Keck. Thanks for joining us right here on Bookmark. Take it easy.